Today, Ukraine is considered the most mined country in the world. More than 30% of Ukraine's territory is contaminated by Russian mines, unexploded ordnance, and booby traps that were left behind by the Russian terrorists. But while Russia is busy sowing death into Ukrainian soil, there is a group of people risking their lives every single day in order to remove Russian mines and IEDs from civilian houses and fields in Ukraine. Of course, we're talking about Ukrainian military engineers, and by Ukrainian, I don't necessarily mean Ukrainian nationals, because today there's literally hundreds of experienced international volunteers removing Russian mines all over Ukraine. From dangerous Russian petal mines to booby traps hidden in children's toys by the Russian terrorists, the military engineers are dealing with deadly explosives every single day. In my opinion, these guys are the unsung heroes of this war. So today, let's talk about them. The role of Ukrainian military engineers didn't start with the full-scale invasion, because since 2014, during the hybrid Russian invasion in Donbass, engineers were already building fortifications and clearing unexploded ordnance left behind by the so-called Russian world. Already in 2014, Kremlin supplied its hybrid forces in Donbass with a large number of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. But not only that. For example, in 2019-2020, my brigade deployed to the Svetlodarsk Bulge faced Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. They likely belonged to the FSB Center of Special Forces Sputnik. There were numerous cases of them using remotely delivered anti-personnel mines like POM-2 that were only produced in Russia, which again took place in 2019-2020, when Putin publicly claimed that there were no Russians in Donbass. 4 years later, during the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, engineers became one of the most critical elements of Ukraine's defense. Today they dig trenches, reinforce positions, build field fortifications, bridges and roads, and all that under constant fire coming from either Russian artillery or Russian drones. If you've seen those massive dragon teeth and tank traps in Zaporizhia or the trench systems around Sumy, engineers were there working day and night, but defense is only half of it. Every successful Ukrainian counteroffensive like Kherson, Kharkiv or Robotyne started with engineers that were crawling through a deadly chessboard of explosives, clearing the way. Since 2014 and all the way until 2025, the terrorist Russian regime has laid down the largest minefields in Europe since World War II. Some stretches of land, like those in Zaporizhia, for example, have 7 layers of mines. We're talking anti-personnel, anti-tank, sensor-triggered and remotely delivered mines. In 2023 and 2024, during Ukraine's counteroffensive, the Russian minefields became a deadly barrier. Soldiers couldn't move without engineers clearing the path first, which significantly delayed Ukraine's operations. Some of the military experts, for example, still tend to criticize Ukraine's attempt to liberate fortified settlements protected by layers of the Russian minefields without proper demining equipment, without close air support, which is something that not a single army of NATO would ever dare. Fact is, Russian terrorists also love creativity, if by creativity you mean war crimes. For example, the so-called petal mines. These are tiny plastic mines delivered remotely by the Russian MLRS. They are hard to see, also really hard to detect, and are often picked up by kids thinking it's a toy. Petal mines usually carry enough explosives to introduce severe injuries to grown-ups, but when picked up by the kids, they are often lethal. The Russian booby traps are literally everywhere. We're talking tripwires in civilian homes, explosives hidden in children's toys, even bombs wired to washing machines and doors, for example, like those found in Hostomel, Bucha, Irpin, or in Kharkiv and Kherson, after the Russian retreat. Speaking of anti-tank mines, Russian terrorists often use them in combination with the so-called surprise mines. These devices are activated by applying pressure on the detonator, but they only explode when the pressure is released. Most commonly, they dig a small pit, put a surprise mine on the bottom, and then plant a heavier anti-tank mine on top of it. Such combinations are usually impossible to remove without detonation, but because the surprise mines are highly versatile, they're also often used as booby traps planted in civilian houses, on the bus stations, etc. Besides Russian booby traps and mines, there's also the leftovers like unexploded shells, aerial bombs, Shahed debris, cluster munitions, missiles. Ukrainian engineers also deal with sabotage attempts and traps on Ukrainian-controlled territory, usually planted by either Russian spies or left by the retreating Russian terrorists. Recently, Russian FSB started recruiting Ukrainian citizens, mostly teenagers, to deliver the IEDs to police stations or plant them under military vehicles. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of such cases. And those are just a few challenges that military engineers are facing daily in Ukraine. Now, what do they use to clear the deadly remains of the Russian world? Let's take a closer look. Thanks to Western partners, today Ukrainian engineers are equipped with state-of-the-art gear. We're talking metal detectors and ground-penetrating radars from the United States, from United Kingdom, Germany, and other countries. Also, they use remote-controlled demining machines like the DOK-ING, MV4, Bozhena 5, and Amtrak 400, which basically look like tiny tanks with flails instead of guns. Also, protective suits rated for high blast zones, although many engineers still work with little more than a helmet and nerves of steel, because when you deal with a 10-kilogram anti-tank mine, the body armor usually becomes nothing more than a psychological protection. And of course, it's really hard to imagine a successful demining operation that would not involve our best friends, the K9. The most famous face of Ukrainian demining is, of course, Patron, the dog, a tiny Jack Russell Terrier with a big heart and a big nose for explosives. Patron has helped clear hundreds of explosive devices, mostly in Chernihiv, and he's also a national hero in Ukraine, a UNICEF ambassador, and a true legend widely recognized around the globe. The story of Patron proves that even small creatures can successfully fight big evil, and that is because they're fighting for the right cause. Every single Russian mine cleared is a life saved. Thanks to Ukrainian engineers and the volunteers from around the world, the life returns to the Ukrainian liberated territories. The fields can grow crops again, roads can reopen, the children can play, and families can return home. These heroes don't ask for much, just decent equipment and support, and basically they will do the rest while the world watches the big battles. These soldiers fight one of the quietest and most dangerous, the war against mines and terror. So next time you see a news report about a town being liberated or a field being planted again, always remember the brave engineers from Ukraine and from around the globe who made this possible. Ukraine will win this war, not just with tanks and drones, but also with careful, patient hands of the people who make sure that it's safe to take the next step. My name is Operator Starsky. Thanks for watching.